Hello and welcome to the EHR 5.9 8.4 Enhancement Series. This session is going to cover new functionality for electronic prior authorization. During this session, we're going to focus on the following areas. We'll start with the purpose and the functionality of the feature. We will talk a little bit about workflow, and we'll talk about the setup. The new electronic prior authorization functionality is basically used to manage all medication prior authorization needs directly in the EHR application. And what we've done is we've partnered with SureScripts to provide their service they call Complete EPA. And this provides a solution to the current manual process that many of your organizations are already having to endure. Basically, what you'll see is that this is a web service that's hosted within the EHR application and also interacts with other functionality that we already have in the EHR. To start with the functionality here, providers or clinical staff members can request prior authorization approval when they create the medication order. So this process actually starts before the prescription is sent to the pharmacy, and requests are completed per medication or one at a time. So it's going to be centered around the medication module to begin with. And again, it starts at the beginning of the process when you're adding those medications to the chart. From there, the user is able to click the Initiate EPA link that's again in that medication module, and it starts the process. Once that link is clicked, though, the medication is locked for edit until the PBM or the pharmacy benefit manager responds with the next step. Now, also keep in mind that prior authorization needs are based on the PBM that's associated to the patient. So thinking about some other functionality, we determine who the PBM is based on our formulary eligibility check. So you have to actually run this eligibility check before the EPA data can be obtained. And in this case, if you tried to go forward without it, the user might be prompted to continue without formulary. But if you select yes, then it will cancel the EPA process. So you absolutely have to run eligibility first and have that PBM associated to the patient. Now, of course, some of it is going to start with searching for medications. So I want you to keep in mind, you can use either the default or the formulary medication search windows, but there is a benefit to using the formulary search. In this case, we have a coverage column, and you'll see either prior auth or PA will show in that column, and you'll kind of know ahead of time if prior authorization is needed for that PBM. And so therefore, searching for the medication will show you. It might even deter you from selecting that medication, maybe if there's an alternative that will work. But if not, you just know that you need to initiate that process. Now, also keep in mind the PBM is part of the process, so during the search, if you're going to use that formulary search, you need to select the associated PBM if that patient happens to be eligible for more than one. Sometimes that does happen. They're connected through different insurance plans, and so therefore you need to choose the one to get the right prior authorization status. Now, if you don't actually use the formulary search, you're not negating this information. It just might mean that you have to choose the PBM at the time you're initiating the EPA request. Now, you're also going to notice this window. It's called the Manage EPA window, and it's actually behind the scenes referred to as a SureScripts accelerator tool. This is their web service that they use to complete all of the EPA information. And the users are actually communicating directly with the pharmacy benefit manager. So you'll see a lot of information like you see here, that's a work list of information, which is various, almost like tasks that you have to do. And then there's a task history. So one of the things that you're often going to have to do with Manage EPA is complete and submit question sets. This is basically when the PBM responds to the initial request and they give you a question set so that they can obtain additional information needed to make their decision. The good thing is that it's accessible within seconds of submitting the request, but it doesn't have to be completed right away. So it's not meant to halt your workflow process. Even if it's the provider that initiates the request, a clinical staff member could go in and complete the question set at a later time. It just basically returns that information right away so that it's easy to complete when the actual user is ready. And again, you're using this to provide that information that's necessary for the PBM to complete the authorization. So once you've completed the questionnaire, you actually submit it back to them. And here's how it kind of starts out. You have the information in your work list, and when you click on it, you get a little bit of confirmation information, things about the patient, payer, provider, and then you click the Start button to move it along through the questions. You'll also be able to manage approval and denial responses. So this is after that question set is completed. The PBM typically responds back within 12 hours of you giving them the answers to their question set. And so from there, all the necessary EPA details will be provided in either the approval or the denial. And once you have that information, the prescription can be sent to the pharmacy, and it will include the EPA details. Now, hopefully, if it is an approval, of course, you'll just be sending it along to the pharmacy, and they'll be able to fill that prescription. Technically, if it's a denial, you actually might want to consider initiating an appeal, and you can do that appeal right from the same Manage EPA window. So really, all of your prior authorization needs are going to be handled right here. And then you can always look at the task history too if you want to see things that were already done. So work list is what needs to be done. It's like your to-do list. Task history is what you already did, but you can always go back to it. So that way you can kind of reference what you did or didn't do and when it occurred and just all of that information. Now, access is going to depend on a little bit of scenario situations. So first of all, both providers and clinical staff members can use this tool. I foresee that it's probably more of a clinical staff user. You want to equate this to whoever is handling prior authorization needs now. That's probably the one that will be doing this. But I would encourage the provider to maybe get involved in the initiating process so that it speeds things up. If they find out that the prescription needs a prior authorization from that formulary search window, they can just click that process and then everything gets moving quicker. But they don't have to. It can be initiated at any time it's discovered that it's needed. So access, of course, could start in the medication module. This could be in the new Manage EPA button. So there's an actual button that you click to launch the window, and that's what we call patient mode. So requests are managed for that current patient. Your work list would be filtered for that specific patient only. But even better, you can get to it from the View menu. There's an option called Manage EPA, and we call this Provider Mode. So the current provider in the 4-point check drop-down is what we're talking about here, and you can manage all requests for that current provider. So multiple patients would be listed here. And what's great about this is that you probably have periods of time in the day where your users are working on prior authorization. It's probably not likely an on-demand situation because you have to keep your patients moving through their visit. So if that is the case, then you can use this option to get all of your requests managed. And we're not just talking about sending question sets. We're talking about confirming approvals and denials and initiating appeals and anything that's in your work list. So they can use it almost like a mini inbox, if you will. So do keep in mind patient mode from the med module, and you click the Manage EPA button, or you can do it for all patients for the current provider under the View menu. And here's a quick screenshot of the Manage EPA button. It's in our standard toolbar for the module, so you can just see it's just right along the lines of many of our other options. And the View menu, here you have it, current provider in the drop-down in the top toolbar, and then you select Manage EPA, and it'll launch the window. You might also want to consider adding the prior authorization status column to the medication module because there's going to be various statuses that will display based on the progress of the EPA. So in the medication module, users can view this data to determine even if a prior authorization is needed. You might see something like PA required, and that can tell the user they need to put that information in. That's going to be helpful if you're not using the formulary search box, because remember, the formulary search tells you in the search process. But if you use the default search, you don't get that benefit, and so therefore having the status column will help you know. Also, you'll see things like in progress and stuff like that. So in fact, these are the types of statuses that you might see in the column. PA required, which tells the users you need to actually complete a prior authorization. And in fact, you're not going to be able to send the prescription until you complete that EPA. It's been flagged as needing a prior authorization. In progress tells you the request is initiated and we're waiting on additional information from the PBM. And again, you can't send the prescription. Action required indicates that the user needs to do something. That's usually going to be the question set. You'll also see approved or denied. Eventually, the request will come back and you'll know if it's approved or denied, and you can send it to the pharmacy. Now keep in mind, if it's approved, all the necessary prior auth details go to the pharmacy so that you don't have to go through this process all over again. Denied requests can still be sent to the pharmacy, but of course it's going to affect how much the patient will pay for that medication. And then closed or canceled could be seen if it wasn't approved or denied and you canceled it for some reason, or you might see an error if something happened, in which case you might have to go through support for assistance or contact the PBM. Also keep in mind that EPA has been integrated with clinical tasking. Now, I do want to be clear about something. It can function without tasking at all. You don't have to initiate the tasking side of it because it's accessible through the medication module and you can get to your work list from the view menu. But a good benefit of the tasking is that the next-gen communication services will poll the system looking for prior authorization status changes. And anytime something is posted, the field is called EPA request RX EPA status, and it finds that and it'll trigger a task. So therefore, the user will receive a task for the various actions, not just the question set, but approvals, denials, initiating appeals. Any of that information can be seen in the tasks, and you'll be able to perform the same actions from your task directly. So manage EPA is accessible here, and send RX for once your PA is approved or possibly even denied. So all of that is initiated from the task list, making it a lot easier to manage and to know when it's come in. And again, as I mentioned, those tasks are triggered when the status is changed. So it could go from PA required to action required. That would be a status change that would generate a task. Or you might get approved or denied. That'll generate a task. So it's a great way to involve those users. And the tasks will be routed to the prescribing provider or the associated work group. So it's similar to how we handle refills. And the user would still do the accept or reject for the task, because if you're talking about a work group, you want to make sure only one user is working on the prior authorization needs. And you could reassign the task if you needed to later. Now, from a workflow perspective, all of the stuff that we've talked about so far is just kind of the functionality. But remember that the workflow starts with creating a prescription. You're going to run an eligibility request to determine the PBM. That's usually done either by opening the medication module or creating a new encounter. Now, you could also manually do it, but this process is hopefully already in your workflow because we've had it for a while, and it's also part of some of your ACI reporting needs. So from there, you click Prescribe New to search for your medication, and you could use the default search, but we recommend the formulary search because of the extra prior authorization status information. And then you complete your necessary prescription details. That right there is typical workflow. So keep your same medication workflow up to the completing of the details. You're not sending at this point. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. If the medication has been determined to need a prior authorization, you cannot send the prescription to the pharmacy. And even if you did, you're going to find that the pharmacy is going to get the same request from the PBM, and they're just going to have to handle it manually, or you guys will. So you'll want to make sure that you understand it stops the process temporarily, but it always has. Prior authorization always stops the prescription process. So from there, you would click Initiate EPA, and this is a link in the medication module next to the Accept button. And it's possible if you used the default medication search, you didn't choose the PBM, so you might get prompted here to pick the PBM. And it's also possible that that Initiate EPA link might be disabled. This is, obviously it would be disabled if the medication doesn't need a prior authorization, but if it does need one and it's still disabled, there's a tooltip. One of the good examples of why it might be disabled is if you have the practice preference set to always send generic if not dispensed as written. That's a common practice preference setting that I see a lot of people have enabled, and that's going to cause a problem with the Initiate EPA because it's trying to send the generic medication. So make sure your users are checkboxing dispenses written if that's what they really intend, or don't have the practice preference enabled. Of course, generic, if it's okay, then you certainly can have that. But if you don't, you have to use dispenses written, or you have to uncheck the practice preference. So click EPA or Initiate EPA should be done by the provider as long as they've seen either the status in the formulary search or the status in the column that we recommended adding. So that way it speeds things up a little bit in the process. But all they have to do is click the link. They don't have to complete details. From there, the EPA request, it usually takes a few seconds, and a work list item will be generated to complete prior authorization details or criteria. And that's where you go to the Manage EPA window to complete the question set. So from a workflow process, we're not saying the provider would stop what they're doing and complete all of this unless they want to. That's perfectly fine, but it could be handled by a clinical staff member at any other point in time. Once it generates that work list item, it's there and accessible for anybody who can access that provider's work list. Remember, it's based on the drop-down list in the 4-point check, so you're able to get to it as any user. Now, also keep in mind that the tasking will come into play here too, so your users might get notified that a task has returned, the need to complete the question set. But jumping forward, once you know that you need to complete it, you simply click on the prior authorization criteria link, and it might prompt you to choose the medication if you need a PA for more than one, and then you click Start to Begin. So if you look here, you're actually completing real questions. So for example, diagnoses or other medications that they've taken, things like that will be asked. And you click through the questions one by one, clicking Next to move on. You can also return to the work list at any time, so if you need to get more information, you can exit the window and not affect your progress. You can actually pick up where you left off, or you can start over at any time as well. There's a Start Over button. So it's a lot like just a standard survey tool. You'll also see a progress bar to show how much has been completed, so you're not just wondering if you're going to be completing a million questions. You'll know where you're at. And then when you're done, you click Submit, and then it'll send that information onto the PBM. It sends it through SureScripts through the communication services. So that's kind of how the process works in a way. You initiate the request, you complete the details for the question set, and then you wait for the approval or the denial. Now that's where the tasking is really helpful, because the task itself will be received when the approval or denial comes back. And so therefore you're not just sitting around checking the work list. You're checking your inbox like you always are. And then, of course, based on the approval or denial, you continue on with the prescription. And that part of the workflow is not different. You send it through ERX your normal way or through the task. We do have some best practices to keep in mind. First one is to add a diagnosis to the medication. This is typically needed for the prior authorization. And so therefore it'll speed up the process. The PBM will typically want it. You do get a warning if no diagnosis is selected, but in that case, it doesn't stop you. You also want to make sure that you have a default pharmacy for the patient because it'll help get the pharmacy information that's needed. But again, it's not a requirement. But there are some required medication details. The PBM will need the SIG and they'll need the quantity for the medication. We also require that usually for sending prescriptions, and so therefore you might already be doing it. So it should be pretty standard. Here's a couple of possible errors or alerts you might see. So this one says no diagnosis is selected. This could delay the response from the PBM. Here's no pharmacy information will be sent with the initiation request because none was selected, but notice both of them say you can proceed anyway. And then here is an alert you might get if no quantity was selected or no SIG was selected or things like that. Now also with the workflow, the tasking is a helpful option. So when you open your inbox and you go to clinical tasking, you'll see a task that will tell you where you're at with that prior authorization. From there, for example, you could click Manage EPA. Most of them you'll have to click Manage EPA because that's where your question set will be, and that's where you acknowledge approvals and denials, and it's where you initiate appeals. So using that Manage EPA button will help, and it's right in your standard toolbar. So from there, you open it up, and in this order of events, you would complete the question set. Once you're done, you can also click Send RX. This is for the approvals. You still click Manage EPA to acknowledge the approval, but then you click Send RX to generate it to the pharmacy. It will do ERX only from this button, so if you need to print or fax, it needs to go through the medication module, but that's still possible. And the task will autocomplete when the task from the Manage EPA is done, or when you send the prescription. And you'll also get an autocomplete for the task even if you complete it in the medication module or the view menu. Wherever you access Manage EPA, if there's a task tied to it, it'll complete it for you. So that's kind of your workflow there. For setup, there is a setting in System Administrator Universal Preferences. It's under the e-prescribing folder, and you'll click to enable electronic prior authorization. It'll either be true or false, but of course to use it, you want it to be true. We also have some new group rights under Operations, Medications. There's Initiate EPA, so who's allowed to actually click that link to initiate requests, and then allow access to Manage EPA, so who can complete the work list items like the question sets and appeals and approvals and things like that. You'll also need to make sure you enroll your providers in the EPA service. This is under the retail service level, and then you'll update their enrollment. You'll have to complete this individually for each provider. And then you also have set up for tasking. This is also in the provider master file, same e-prescribing tab. You can set a tasking work group and category for your EPA tasks. Now this section has been slightly redesigned. We used to just have a couple of drop-down lists, but now we allow work groups to be set for a few more features like RX change and EPA. So you need to set them here. You could use the same work group that you do for all of the other medication-related task types, or you could create a new one, and you could do the same for categories. And this has to also be completed per provider. And then finally, with the setup, you want to consider user preferences under the grid preferences, adding prior authorization columns for each user. So the medication module should have the prior authorization status so that users can see that status information, but you could also consider prior authorization date and ID if needed. You don't have to add those because they're also available in the additional details of each prescription, but if you want to, you can add that. And then also for some of you on the back end side, this is where the next-gen communication services really plays a big part here. There's a new processor under e-prescribing retail, and it's called EPA import. It should be enabled upon upgrade, but you might want to confirm it. So if you have users that can access this, make sure they check. Otherwise, if you're hosted, go through your hosting service. And this is what connects to that SureScripts web service. So it can't function without this processor. You can also set a polling period time frame to look for those status changes, and that's what's going to generate your tasks. It's usually just a few seconds. So here you can see the settings that need to be enabled, pretty standard for communication services. But at the very bottom, you have your polling period if you're going to be doing the tasking, and you can enable the tasking as well. Now, just something to consider, this is an optional setting, but you could do task preferences and set a filter for each user to have their EPA tasks filtered. This is similar to how we handle refill tasks, but it would be separate, a separate category and everything. And it's something that you can do to help you be able to kind of maintain your tasks easier, like a folder almost of all of your individual EPA tasks. So you could consider this. It's available for all other task types too. So if you're already doing it, I would recommend it here. If your users are not in the habit of using filters, maybe consider it, but it's also something, of course, you don't have to do. Now, we also have a couple of other details to look at before we check out our demo. So there's an exclusion list exception here. EPA cannot be run for any patient that's on any user's exclusion list. This is because the SureScripts Accelerator tool does not have the ability to filter those restricted patients. And if you did get in there, you might accidentally have accidental PHI exposure. So we don't want that to happen, so existing prior authorization process would have to be used. Paper forms, phone calls, whatever you were using for patients that are on an exclusion list. Hopefully you're not dealing with a lot of patients that have this situation. And again, we're still talking about just prior authorization, so it's not every medication either. So it shouldn't hinder things too much, but it's just so that we don't accidentally expose that information to the wrong people. Also, clinical users that have an exclusion list can't access the Manage EPA from the View menu. That's the provider mode. So anybody who has an active exclusion list, even if it's not for that patient, they can't get to the provider view, which shows you multiple patients. And that's because of the fact you can't filter out those restricted patients. It's a SureScripts web service tool, so they don't honor our exclusion lists through their service. So therefore, you would only be able to get to it through the medication module, which is the patient mode, and that's okay because as long as they're in that chart, that means that's not part of their exclusion list. So again, it's to prevent accidental PHI exposure. Also, data is visible in the ERX status and provider status windows. The EPA case number and prior auth status will display on the RX print and fax so that the pharmacy gets it, and it sends with the ERX as well. Template editor and document builder were also updated to include authorization status information in the patient medication trigger and medication summary macros. So if you need to add this to documents for other needs, you can as well. And that's basically everything. So let's go ahead and take a look at this in the application. So here you can see that I've brought up our EHR application and I've opened up a patient's chart under today's encounter. I also want to point out that at some point in the process, it also ran an eligibility request, and that's typically done either by creating a new encounter or by opening up the medication module. So I have that information ready to go, which is going to contribute to my EPA process. Now, again, you want to keep in mind that your workflow is going to start out the same as your typical prescription workflow. So we're going to start by clicking Prescribe New. From here, you can see that this user has chosen to use the default medication search. So therefore, if I do a search for the medication, I get all the dose information, but I'm not necessarily going to get any details about prior authorization. Since this does involve the PBM related to the formulary, remember you can also utilize the formulary search option. So if I happen to default to this method here, I could toggle over to this Use Formulary option and change my search window. From there, of course, I would still search for the medication that I'm looking for. And then if a prior authorization is needed, you would see that information listed in this coverage column. And so therefore, that way you can determine ahead of time if it really needs to have a prior authorization or not. Either way, once you select that medication, you can go ahead and add it to a temporary state within the chart. So first thing I have to do is make sure I have all the necessary details. So I need to have a SIG, and I need to set my quantity. And for this case, I'll go ahead and do some refills. And remember that we also have the practice preference setting that will say to always send generic medications if it's not dispensed as written. That's going to stop the EPA process because you're not typically going to need it for the generic medication. So I'm going to go ahead and mark this as dispense as written so that we can get through the next steps. So once I'm done, I can click accept, and it'll save this medication to the chart. From there, I'm not going to send it to the pharmacy yet because we have already determined that this would be a medication that requires prior authorization. So what the provider would do next is simply click the Initiate EPA link. Sometimes when you do that, you might get some of these alerts. Remember, we talked about the fact that a diagnosis added to the medication is kind of a best practice because you can get a quicker response from the PBM. So I could either cancel and add a diagnosis here, or I could just click OK and proceed without it. I might also see that there was no default pharmacy associated to the patient. And again, that's going to keep information from being sent to the PBM. So it's a good idea to have it, but notice again, it lets you proceed anyway. And then finally, everything just gets automatically sent. So we don't have to do anything else with this individual medication at this point in time. The nice thing is that the provider can move on to other prescriptions. If they did have some that don't have prior authorization, they could send them. Or you could click Initiate EPA if they did require a prior auth. Or you could just move on to the rest of your visit. So just because we've initiated the EPA doesn't mean we have to do anything else from here. But do keep in mind you are able to access the Manage EPA window directly from the module. So if the provider wants to continue the next step, they just need to access the button in their toolbar. So mine has so many buttons with my resolution here that I had to click this drop-down menu. But here you can see Manage EPA, and you can click on that here to launch the patient-specific Manage EPA window. So this would be, again, if you want to continue along with the workflow from the provider's perspective. Otherwise, if we close the window and close the medication module, remember that any user who has access to this process could also get to it from the View menu. And if you go down to Manage EPA right here, it's connecting to the provider that's in your top drop-down of the application. And when you open it up, it's no longer just patient-specific. It's all the patients associated to that provider that require prior authorization steps. So this would be like a bulk way of being able to access it. And one more step, which would be probably beneficial down the road in terms of the fact that most people are not going to immediately engage in the prior authorization process would be to access your inbox. So as a user, I have been assigned to a work group for this provider, and so therefore I receive tasks when an EPA status has changed. Remember in the PowerPoint, we talked about the fact that the next-gen communication services will poll the system looking for status changes, and anytime that changes, you get a task, and it'll go to the entire work group. So I can scroll through here, for example, and show you this one. It says EPA action required. And if I look at the task details, it really just gives me enough information to know the medication name. Of course, the patient and the provider are included as well. But at the bottom of the task in the toolbar, I can see the Manage EPA button. So this is the same window that I could have accessed in the other two places we discussed. But here, if I click on it, it once again is patient specific, but it's actually taking me directly to the work list item associated to the task. Our previous example just had all the tasks for one patient or all the tasks related to that provider. So this one just drilled it down all the way to where we needed it to be. So when you see that action required type of task, that is the question set. So we'll expand this window a little, and you can see that I have patient, provider, and payer information. And then when I'm ready, I just click Start. So from there, I can go through and I can answer my questions. Most of them are yes or no or just simple answers. We'll click Next. So here you can see question 2. And from there, you can also see my progress bar is starting to move as I answer my questions. And you can also see that sometimes there's a free text option. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next. So from there, I have the ability to be able to submit this information. So you can see the Submit button is available. I also happen to see a little alert on this one that says deadline to submit the question set has expired and may be denied by the PBM. I left it here because I wanted you to see that this does need to be handled in a timely manner. It does need to be completed within the same business day of that authorization being submitted. So therefore, you just want to make sure that when you're incorporating this into your workflow, it's being done in the same business day. It doesn't have to be done immediately, but at some point in the day it does. So either way, I'm just going to go ahead and click Submit. And it closed that particular item, and it took me back to my main work list. It's possible I might have some other patients I need to work on. I'm not likely going to see an immediate response from the PBM regarding this patient and this prior authorization, but eventually I'll come back here and I'll see their response as well. But that's kind of how you complete that question set. So again, you can access the Manage EPA through the medication module, the view menu, or the task, but the task is the preferred method. You'll also see that once you click the Manage EPA, it accepted the task for that user, and it will also complete the task as well. Now, going on in the future, probably about 12 hours approximately in the future, we should get a response from the PBM as far as their approval or denial for that request. So if you look at some of my other tasks, I can see here EPA denied, or I can see another one where it was approved. And so when you get these tasks, again, it's just looking for acknowledgement of this information. So if I see approved, first thing I want to do is navigate down to that Manage EPA button, again, at the bottom of the task toolbar. And I'm going to see this information. This is just saying that it was approved, but you'll notice the button that says Acknowledge Approved PA. So I'm going to click that. It's going to take me back to my work list here, but I can close it and it will complete my task for me. I can then go on to the Send RX button. So this one's been approved. That means we're ready to send it to the pharmacy. So next to the Manage EPA is Send RX. When you do this, you're going to go through the typical steps that you would when you're adding a medication to the module. It's actually doing that behind the scenes. So we're just going to go ahead and send all of this information, choose my pharmacy, because remember, I didn't do that initially, so I can go ahead and just find one here. And then I'm sending it along, so my typical send prescription, and now everything has been completed, including my task. So all that information is now in the chart. And then again, we also have that denial. And so in this case, if it was denied, I can still do the same thing where I can click on the Manage EPA. But as far as the Send RX, I don't have that button available. I could still technically send it to the pharmacy, but it's not embedded into the task. I would have to do that in the actual medication module. But here I can click Manage EPA. And again, I need to acknowledge the denied prior authorization. Returns me back to my work list. It's getting shorter now because I'm completing those tasks. And then I can close the window and I can move on from there, and it's completing everything for me. So basically, you just want to make sure that anybody who's going to be involved in this process is checking their task list, acknowledging them as needed, and working through the process of making sure the prescription makes it to the patient. So that's really everything for the end user side of things. And just real quick, I wanted to jump into file maintenance.